Automated Podcast.
Welcome to Automated. I'm your host, Mark Verbenkov, and in this weekly podcast, we will be exploring the impact of emerging technology on jobs, society, as well as us, with business and technology leaders, researchers, and independent professionals across the world. So if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, I'm sure that you have heard of Universal Basic Income, or more commonly known as UBI, mentioned a number of times. So of course, before COVID, UBI was almost always associated with fears of technological unemployment and offered as perhaps kind of the number one solution for this eventual scenario. And I think that for this reason, it has been the subject of a lot of discussion, debate, and of course, programs to trial it out. But on today's episode, I'm joined by Hilde Latour of the Basic Income Earth Network to talk about the super interesting and increasingly relevant topic. So we discuss the arguments for and against universal basic income to kind of lay a foundation for the rest of the discussion. We then talk about the impact that COVID has had on it, as well as the numerous pilot studies that have happened across the world and what we can really take away from them. So Hilde is the vice chair for the Basic Income Earth Network, the co-founder of Mission Possible 2030, board member of Basic Income from the Netherlands, and a TEDx speaker with her speech Building Commons on the Blockchain. So if you have been interested about universal basic income and want to get a good primer, but also get a little bit more into the details and some of the more interesting and maybe even outlier ideas, this is definitely a podcast for you. Well, hi there, Hilde. Thank you very much for coming on to the Automated Podcast today. It's great to finally have somebody to talk about universal basic income, which I think is one, as we were talking about right before, is kind of one of those natural things that comes out of the discussion of automation and technological unemployment in general. So great to have you onto the podcast today.
Oh, thank you for the invite, Mark.
Absolutely.
Happy to be here.
So in my kind of journey in automation, podcast and otherwise, universal basic income is always one of those topics that is kind of interesting for people to talk about. So, I mean, I have my own kind of personal interest in it, but maybe we can get you to discuss what you originally got interested in universal basic income for.
I think it was about 10, 15 years ago that I came across the concept of basic income.
Mm-hmm.
And I immediately realized that it is the easiest and simplest way to eliminate poverty.
Mm-hmm,
Just give the money to the people, and then poverty is eliminated. And then I first started as a writer for Basic Income News, which is a website from Basic Income Earth Network. And the more I learned about basic income, the more I realized that it is much more than eliminating poverty.
Right.
It is also very much about not judging other people's behavior and just give unconditionally money to the people. It's about freedom of choice, absolute freedom of choice. It's about giving people the opportunity to follow their passion and their heart when they decide what to do with their life. So for me, it is much more than just eliminating poverty. It's an act of unconditional love to every human being on earth, basically.
Oh, it's an interesting way of looking at it. Maybe to kind of set the context for all the listeners, I think most people have heard of basic income or universal basic income in one way or another, but maybe just so that we have a kind of a definition going forward, could you just briefly define what universal basic income is so that we can have a proper discussion on it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's actually very simple. It's a periodic cash payment, unconditionally delivered to all human beings on an individual basis without means testing or work requirements.
Right.
And it's very important that it is cash or money, any kind of money, because only with cash, people can have the freedom to choose what to spend it on or if they want to save it. And it's also very important to give it on an individual basis, so that people are not dependent on their spouse for access to their basic needs, basically, and that it is absolutely unconditional.
Right. Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously, as I've been looking at it as well over the last couple of years, I think that's also one of the interesting things that you pointed out, the freedom to choose what to do with that money as it comes in. That seems to be in either the kind of use cases or the pilot studies that we'll talk about in a bit. That seems to be kind of one of those key criteria that is, I guess you could say, even like makes the whole thing worthwhile or actually implemented. Because if you're trying to force people down one certain route or have them only focus on spending it in one specific way, it kind of seems like it seems to fall apart at the edges anyways when you start doing things like that.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's very paternalistic to ask people to spend the money on something that, yeah, they have no saying in, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
So again, like in my previous discussions on universal basic income, there's definitely people that take kind of one or two sides, right? Whether they're for it or against it. So I think it would be kind of interesting for the audience and also interesting for myself to maybe discuss that a little bit today. So could we maybe start on the arguments against universal basic income? Kind of like what are I mean, there's many different arguments, but maybe we can just touch on some of those key ones that come to your mind.
Yeah, well, I have no arguments against basic income,
Sure.
obviously, but the arguments that we hear quite often is, for example, that it is too expensive, which is actually not true. It actually saves money if you compare it to what we do now. I mean, we have so many targeted subsidies where a lot of the money is lost somewhere with the intermediaries. The effects of basic income are so diverse. I mean, it reduces crime rates, it increases health, it increases, well, it benefits even the local economy. So a lot of the money is coming back into the system. And so the argument that it is too expensive is actually not a real argument if you look at the evidence and the data. But it's a very, well, it's an argument that keeps coming up all the time. Then another argument is that people will become lazy when they receive a basic income. That is usually brought up by people that are not dependent on income to spend their time. What we see in the pilot studies is that most people actually do work when they receive a basic income. They may change direction. Yeah, they may quit that job and do something else. But most people actually are very active when they receive a basic income. It's basically just a guarantee that you have access to your basic needs. And most people have the intention to do good for themselves and their surroundings. And there's also in that discussion, it's also important to notice that there's a lot of people, mostly women, that do unpaid work. Yeah, so care workers, for example. And so if you touch that that space of are people going to work, then you really have to think about what is work.
Yeah.
What do we call work? Do we mean a job where you pay taxes, or do we mean that you're actually active doing things, and that includes thinking and writing? And then yeah, maybe another argument that comes up quite often is that basic income would increase inflation.
Right.
Well, that's a very philosophical question, actually, because if you look at history, then we have had inflation since the Fed was introduced, and we never had a basic income. So yeah, I don't think that basic income would increase inflation. On the other hand, I mean, if you just think about what basic income can do, it can, well, it will give people more money, yeah, so they will be able to spend more. That could increase the prices of products and services, but people could also work for less money, so it can go either way. Yeah, I mean, again, I think inflation is more a political choice than a natural thing. So those are I think, the main arguments against basic income, or that are brought forward against basic income.
I'll just add one more, because I know if I don't touch on this, some of the listeners will point me out.
Yeah.
I think there's also maybe like a difference between like universal basic income and kind of like basic income. So I think with like universal, it would still go to like millionaires, or even like Jeff Bezos might still get part of this, periodic cash payment. Um, uh, I think that that's also maybe one of the things that makes a lot of people maybe doubt the validity of kind of a universal basic income scheme, because like why would the richest man on earth need another $1,000 or $2,000 a month, and wouldn't that be better, um, I guess, attributed towards somebody who's poor or homeless or something like that? Could you maybe touch on that aspect?
Yeah, it's very important that even Jeff Bezos will receive a basic income. It really has to be unconditional and universal. As soon as you will introduce restrictions, for example, that the millionaires will not receive a basic income, then you immediately have to introduce bureaucracy. You have to introduce control of people about their income. And there are many ways to get the money back from the richest people on earth. You can increase their tax, or you can even, well, most of them don't even pay tax. So, I mean, there are many ways to get the money back from that part of the population. So, and as soon as you bring in restrictions, then the whole concept is basically gone, because it's the strongest argument for basic income is that it is so simple without hardly any bureaucracy. The only condition you have to meet is being human, alive, and unique.
Right,
And
right.
yeah.
Yeah, for the idea that you're pushing, is there like an age limit or an age requirement to have this monthly periodic cash payment to you, like 18, 16, something like that?
Well, that is, of course, a political choice. As BN, we don't give our own opinion, but what usually happens with the experiments, and I'm personally very much in favor of that, is that the children receive half of what the adults receive, and then through the mothers usually.
Okay, interesting. So, I mean, you've already touched on some of the more interesting points regarding the benefits of it, but I think also, as this podcast touches on the social implications of technologies or businesses that are coming out that deal with automation, maybe you could touch a little bit on kind of the benefits to society as kind of a broader idea that that maybe we've seen in some of the pilot sites, but also just in kind of the discourse or the idea of universal basic income as a whole.
Yeah, I think you can approach it from, well, let's say 4 or 5 different directions. One of them is human rights. It is a human right for every human being on earth to have access to your basic needs. And we have designed our societies that we need money to get access to our basic needs. So basic income would very much support the human rights aspect in that sense. You can also approach it from a market economy direction. If you give people money, then they will spend it, and they will be able to, for example, to start their own local businesses, and that is what we see when we look at the experiments. So it will increase and benefit the local economy, and when you have local businesses, that also makes it easier for people to address when something is not going right in their environment, right? If you have a local business that is, I don't know, poisoning your local surroundings, then you know that person, so you will be able to actually directly talk to that person. So that should be a secondary effect. You can also approach it from the direction of social justice. Yeah, so reduce inequality in general, but also reduce inequality between men and women. I've already talked about that many women do unpaid work, so that would be equalized a little bit more. You could have a more anarchistic approach with a very optimistic view of man, and that's more about freedom of choice, freedom to travel, freedom to change direction, People are more empowered to talk to their employers if they don't treat them well. And of course, we have the SDGs. We set a time limit, 2030. We have to achieve all these SDGs. Now, it's obvious that the Sustainable Development Goal number 1, no poverty, that basic income is the easiest way to achieve that. But not only that, and we will probably talk about that a little bit further in depth, but basic income contributes to the majority of the Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah, good health, well-being, education, no hunger, even clean drinking water, crime rates, decent work. So the majority of the Sustainable Development Goals will benefit from a basic income.
Right. Okay, so then maybe to make this a little bit more tangible, we could maybe look at some of the use cases or the pilot sites out there. So I think one of the earlier episodes that I had on this podcast was just me talking about universal basic income. And I remember looking at several of the different pilot studies out there, but this is like a year and a half ago already. And I remember reading that there was, of course, one of the more famous ones, Mincome in the 1970s out of Canada, where I'm from. There was also some interesting studies that came out of, or pilot projects that came out of like India. You can even look at like the Alaskan, what is it, the oil dividend that they have. So and then of course the many different kind of tests that have happened in Europe. So from my perspective, it really seems like there's many different kind of pilot sites that are happening all across the world. Are there any kind of, I guess, universal ideas that are coming out of all of these tests? Like, are there common themes? Are there common trends that we see, across demographics, across nations, across political divides, etc.?
You mean like the effects from basic income? Yeah. I mean, well, one of the universal effects almost is mental health. You've seen that in Mincome, but you also see that, for example, in one of my favorite projects is the casino dividends in Cherokee in the United States.
Okay.
Where they wanted to introduce a casino in a village, and they share the profits from that casino to the community. And then that's already implemented in the 90s. And there were some researchers who collected data from that village and the surrounding villages, and they found that there were less psychiatric disorders, less depression. People worked comparable to the surrounding villages. The school enrollment was better. School enrollment is obviously also almost a universal effect. We saw that in Madhya Pradesh in India, the famous experiments. We also see that in Kenya. Kenya is now the biggest experiment in history, where one of the experimental groups receives a basic income for 12 years. So that would be the first experiment where people really receive a basic income for a longer period of time. And we hope, I mean, the data are not yet available, of course, but we hope that we can then see the long-term effects when people really know that it's going to be an income that is guaranteed for a longer period of time, because a true basic income cannot be taken away from you. And people will then make different choices.
Yeah, precisely. That's I think one of the things that I've read multiple times when looking at some of these pilot cases, right? It's that some of them might be too short, and some of the data or the results might be a bit skewed, because if you're only getting this, so-called universal basic income for say 1 to 2 years, and you know that the end of this trial is going to happen, you might make different decisions based on one that happens, 12 years, or of course the best one, it would happen for your entire life. Can you touch on maybe that a little bit more? Like, have there been some like vastly different results from the shorter term pilots out there versus ones that the 12-year one being the longer one, though we don't have all the data for it yet?
Well, we don't have the data yet from the longer one, but for example, in Madhya Pradesh in India, what happens when people receive the basic income was basically you have a big problem in India is there's a lot of people in bonded labor, which is a form of slavery, basically. And what you saw happening is that people bought themselves free and went back to their villages and started their own businesses. They grew foods on their own small plots of land. But when it stopped, some people had to go back into that situation. And what I've recently heard is that during the experiment, people also invested in community projects like sanitation, drinking water projects. And after the experiment stopped, they decided to, for example, to start seed banks, because previously they had to borrow money to buy seeds, to grow crops, and then they would get themselves into debt. And after the experiment, they realized that it was much more convenient not to be dependent on moneylenders.
Right.
And so that really changed in a structural way the way people organized their businesses and their farming, small farming for the small farmers. What else?
Maybe I could jump in then. The one of the things that you also mentioned at the beginning is kind of one of those arguments against universal basic income is that you would, I guess you would almost automatically assume that people would be lazy, right? But if you're saying that in some of these pilot studies, and I've also read, like, people start businesses, they have that kind of financial security and they start businesses. Do you know if this happens more in, say, kind of like the impoverished towns in India where this has happened compared to, say, like Canada or some of the European nations, or is it kind of comparable when people have that kind of that foundation, that financial stability, that they more or less generally just start businesses or projects or interesting initiatives?
Well, I mean, we had a recent experiment in Finland, but that was not truly universal. It was for long-term unemployed people. But what was really interesting is that compared to the control group, the people that received a small basic income, they actually worked more than the people without basic income, including the people with young children. I mean, there's not that much data, I don't think, about really starting own businesses for the long term available in Europe or in Canada. But I mean, you can imagine that I come from the Netherlands. We have a very, they call it well-developed welfare state. But in my country, if you receive an unemployment benefit and you work on the side, then you have to pay back your unemployment benefit, right? And if you receive a basic income, then work will pay, because you will receive it on top of your basic income. So it actually stimulates and facilitates people to actually work for when and receive money from it. So
no, that's
but
really
in the global
interesting.
south, it's obvious. I mean, people have, they finally see the opportunity, and they have the tools to really accelerate and start whatever they want to do.
I think this is also why I've heard it argued in some of the discussions that I've had before that universal basic income might start in some parts of the global south rather than the global north, even though more of the money would be available for people in the global north, because the kind of advantages would just be so much more experienced at such a higher level down there than they would over here. I mean, I'm in Barcelona too, so.
Yeah, on the other hand, I mean, if you see what's happening now in the United States, where I think it's now even 15 mayors that started basic income schemes in their cities, and so the evidence will pile up, and eventually it's inevitable. And governments, I mean, especially since the lockdown, they are already handing out money. It's not to everyone yet. So the idea of giving money directly to the people is flourishing. So who knows? Who knows? Let's make it a rat race. Which country is going to be first?
Well, I think you touched on one of the things that I really wanted to talk about, was like, how exactly has COVID impacted the universal basic income idea? Because I mean, prior to COVID, when I would talk about UBI, especially on the podcast, it was always in relation to automation, right? The eventual, destruction of all jobs, which is one of those ideas that comes about whenever you're talking about artificial intelligence or robots, etc. Kind of the end result would be a universal basic income scheme that would be, employed whether nationally or globally. But it really seems like COVID, with the inability, like the forced inability of people to not work, universal basic income has kind of grown as an idea from that. Is this something that you're seeing as well, and maybe to kind of what scale you're seeing this?
Yeah, we're seeing that on every continent.
Yeah.
That universal basic income is discussed, and they call it an emergency basic income. We see that well, some governments actually already give money to the people on a limited scale. But there's also something else happening. I mean, it's also I also come across more people that are afraid of basic income,
Okay.
because they are afraid that it will be introduced as a means of control and linked to a social credit system,
Sure.
for example. And my answer to that is always, well, that might be their plan, but in that case, it is not a basic income because it's not unconditional.
Right.
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 Yeah.
Right.
And I know that, for example, in Kenya, where the people already were receiving a basic income because they were participating in the Give Directly program, we know that the people that were in that scheme were much more resilient against the lockdown measures, and that's of course that's, you don't need a university study to understand why.
Yeah. Exactly.
If you're forbidden to work because of a lockdown, then you will not receive money, and there's many people in the global south that are dependent on their daily income. So if today you don't receive money, then today you will not have food, because
Right.
they spend it immediately.
Yeah. So has there really been kind of maybe a shift in mentality when looking at universal basic income, towards this potential fear of like it increasing the bureaucracy of certain nations? I mean, you touched on that a little bit, but I mean, before, I don't think that was discussed very much. It was mostly focused on, as you said before, like decreasing poverty, increasing educational attendance, allowing people to get out of debt or start businesses. Has the narrative shifted a little bit towards, well, now we're maybe a little bit more fearful of UBI because these governments can kind of latch onto it and grow their own kind of bureaucratic systems?
It's not so much a bureaucratic system, because it's there's hardly any bureaucracy, of course, but it can be linked to a social credit system, but what it has maybe triggered is that there are more groups working on a community-driven basic income.
Okay.
So, I mean, with the model of the casino dividends in the back of your head, you can imagine that you can actually build a system where the communities or the businesses can contribute to a basic income. And with new technologies like blockchain, that is fairly easy to do. And for example, it also, if you realize that services like Airbnb or Booking.com or Amazon are actually algorithms behind the scenes that now generate money for the happy few, you can also imagine that you can create those algorithms where the money is distributed to humanity. And there are many programmers that do not have to work anymore because they stepped into Bitcoin at an early stage.
Sure.
And there's a huge open source community where people are building basic income schemes. First, to basically to reach the people on an individual basis. I mean, you don't even need to be documented anymore to open a wallet on the blockchain, so you can receive your money without an ID even. So that opens a huge potential and a field of opportunities, as I call it. from the recipient side, but also from how to make this a sustainable money flow.
So then you really see blockchain as being one of these key enabling technologies for the future of universal basic income across the world, not just in places where you have, what is it, the undocumented, unregistered, and I think the unbanked individuals, which I think is one of the main kind of key driving points of cryptocurrencies or blockchain, depending on where they're going. But you really see as blockchain as being one of those key technologies in enabling this.
Blockchain opens so many opportunities to actually reach the individual people. Well, anywhere. The only thing they need is access to the internet somehow.
Right.
But that doesn't even have to be a smartphone. I mean, you can just have a computer somewhere where you can open your wallet. But it also opens ways to reach the people in countries where governments are not so keen on giving people the money. So it makes it possible that we as a community decide that no, we are going to make sure that every single person on earth has access to enough money, enough resources to meet their basic needs. And there are, of course, a few challenges. One of them is the self-sovereign identity. That we make sure that the data stays with the person and is not flying around and can be used by everyone. We have a few challenges how to prove that the recipient is a real human and not a bot.
Right.
And of course that the recipient is still alive. There's a challenge, how do we make sure that someone only receives once? And do we want to make sure that a person only wants to receive once? Because if you have community-driven schemes, then there will be more schemes. And there will be a diversity of schemes. So, so that's a little bit less of my concern, but from the concept, it should be only once. And it also opens opportunities to create complementary currencies. Everyone can create their own token. So you can also create community currencies that can be spent in the local community and facilitate the local economy even more.
Right.
So I find it a very exciting field to watch and discuss what's happening there.
Yeah, it couldn't agree further with you on that. I'm also, a little bit more on the cryptocurrency side, but I find it a very, very interesting technology and really interesting to see what will happen kind of in the next 10 to 15 years as the technology develops with the growing interest. And of course, you get the programmers and the developers coming in to kind of build out the space. I think I've held off a little bit too long on asking you exactly what organization you're a part of. What does the Basic Income Earth Network actually do, and how are you guys involved in kind of supporting the universal basic income idea coming into the world? So if you could please elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure. Basic Income Earth Network was founded in 1986. It was then Basic Income European Network.
Okay.
And there were basically 70 enthusiasts that came together and wanted to found an organization that was going to be the link between individuals that were interested and wanted to make basic income happen. And then it grew and it grew and it grew. And then in 2004, it became Basic Income Earth Network. And we are an educational charity registered in London, and our main goal is still to be the link and to inform people that are interested about basic income. But we're also a network that connects not only individuals but also basic income organizations from all over the world. We have 37 or 38 affiliate organizations.
Okay.
We organize, one of the affiliates organizes a Basic Income Earth Network conference every year, so that we travel around the world with the conferences, and these are conferences where we, well, not this year because it's going to be an online conference, but normally we meet people from all over the world, basic income activists, academics, artists, and we discuss how to make basic income happen. There are papers, academic papers about the research, about the experiments, so all different kind of topics. As we have become an Earth network, we are now also focusing on translating all our information on the website in different languages. So we're talking about Chinese, Japanese, Hindi, French, and Spanish.
Right.
To reach more people that do not understand English. We are also connecting, for example, I just talked a little bit about the mayors in the United States, but there are also mayors in Brazil, there's governors in Korea. So we organize roundtables to bring those people together so that they can learn from each other about complementary currencies, or how they implement basic income on the local level. We are probably going to start with something like that around blockchain technology as well, because that's something we want to learn about more. Yeah, we originally, as I said, from Europe. If you look at our membership, it's well, the majority is white men around 60 years old. So we're really working hard now to make us, well, to give us a more global appearance as well. So we're reaching out to all continents. We really want to have maybe even regional hubs, in South America and Africa and Asia, to really help people that are advocating basic income and trying to make it happen with our knowledge and our experience, with people that have experience with the experiments that have already been done. We are setting up partnerships now with UNDP. We have recently signed an MOU with academic institutions. So really trying to make it a little bit more than just informing about what basic income is and what's happening all over the world. And,
right.
Yeah.
So one, very interesting. I also think it's really nice how you have kind of a more of an overview of kind of what's happening, maybe not across the entire world, but definitely across a larger subset of the world. One of the questions that came to my mind was, do you see any kind of different regional challenges on maybe not implementing, but starting to think about universal basic income across different regions? Or is it more or less the same kind of challenges that you said at the beginning? Say like the pilot sites that are going to be set up in the States, or were there any kind of specific unique challenges there compared to, say, places in South America that you're aware of?
Well, of course, I mean, if you compare the global north with the global south, then the most important challenge is how do you reach the people in the remote rural areas in the global south, right? I mean, in our countries, well, almost everyone has a smartphone and a bank account and a social service number. But in the global south, that is something completely different. And that is really, really, really a big challenge. How do you reach every single human being?
Yeah.
I think that is that. And and apart from that, I mean, in the end, it is the political will. I mean, it's really strange if you know what the effects of basic income is going to be. It's really strange that it's not there yet.
Yeah.
So there is something about the political will to actually implement it. And so we're really happy that we're going to work with UNDP now, because they have more entrances into the national governments with their local offices. And as I said, there are more and more local initiatives now, because mayors, for example, they see what's happening in their towns, right? So they implement it in for example, in Stockton, they started with the areas, the districts where there was the highest crime rates and poverty levels. And because they knew that most of the crimes are poverty related. So
Right.
yeah.
Right. Right.
And one of the things that is actually also quite interesting to mention is that if what we see, if you give it on a community level, yeah,
Yeah.
so not
Yeah.
the only the long-term unemployed, but if you really give it to a whole village, then automatically this village starts to organize meetings where they discuss where shall we invest our money that will benefit the community as a whole.
Oh, very interesting. Yeah.
That is very interesting, and we even see some communities or groups of people within the community that trust each other, and they decide to give every month one single person in the group a little bit of extra, so that they can make a bigger investment, and then the next month someone else is turn, you know. So
Yeah. Interesting.
that's really interesting that people organize that themselves, and that really shows that, you know, people really want to make this world a better place.
Yeah.
You only have to give them the resources themselves, give them
Yeah.
the tools, and they will do it.
Yeah. 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 I couldn't agree further. um, I think one of the things that also comes up in the discussion is, and maybe this is a little bit more connected to the podcast, the themes of the podcast and automation itself, right? So, like, as time goes on and as we have, you know, the robotic systems and the AI systems built up and implemented everywhere, uh, have you discussed, or people in your organization, have you discussed something like the Robo Tax that was a little bit kind of a popular trend a couple of years ago? Is that something that that has been discussed as a possible solution or way of paying for part of, or if not the entire universal basic income price tag?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, those kind of options to pay for basic income are
Mhm.
heavily discussed in, for example, the Basic Income Conference. You know, Robo Tax,
Mm-hmm.
Eco Tax, whatever else, other kinds of taxes.
Yeah.
These are the things that are discussed. You know, but also a dividend scheme. You know, like
Yeah.
the Alaska Permanent Fund
Yeah.
dividend.
Yeah.
So these are the topics that are discussed intensely during this 3 or 4 day BN conference that we have
Mhm.
every year.
Okay. Is there any one that's kind of doing better in terms of being accepted by all, or is it kind of just a mix between whichever solution fits better to the national priorities?
Yeah, well, in the end, it is the politicians that will have
Yeah.
to decide, what they want to implement. Um, so yeah, no, I cannot really give an answer to that, because I
Mhm.
mean, we are not the ones. The basic income
Yeah.
movement
Yeah.
itself is not are not the ones that can actually will decide.
Mhm.
The only thing we can do is to give them different options. You know, you can do it like this, you can do it like that. You can do implement a robot tax, a wealth tax.
Mhm. Mhm.
So all these options are discussed and put on the table, and but in the end, it's the governments and the people that will have to decide. But it is not a matter of money.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
If you see how much money has been printed in the last year, I think
Yeah.
it's about 20% of the dollar that is circulating now was
Yeah.
printed last year.
Yeah. It's crazy. Yeah.
Money is not an issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, one of maybe the last questions, I do see that our time is running down here. In some of the early kind of desk research that I was doing about universal basic income, I came across a gentleman by the name of Milton Friedman, who's, you know, one of the classic, I think, neoliberal thinkers out there, and he proposed an alternative to universal basic income called the negative income tax. I think I already know how you're going to respond to it, but maybe you could discuss your thoughts on the negative income tax.
Yeah, well, I mean, negative income tax could work in a country where I live, where
Hmm.
where we're all hooked up to the tax system. But how are you going to implement that in Africa?
Yeah.
It's not going to work, not on a global scale, and uh, again, it's also much more bureaucratic. You still need control. Yeah, why would you choose a scheme like that if you can just give the money first and then have people work on the side?
Yeah. Yeah,
It's so
I
much
I knew
easier.
it. Yeah.
But in a country where I live, in Europe, in Western Europe, uh, uh, um, I would receive as much as I would receive with a basic income. Yeah. So in my bank account, it doesn't
Hmm.
really matter.
Hmm.
It's just
Hmm.
that you have to control it after the tax year. So
Right.
so you may have to pay it back, or may have to wait a year before you get it. Um, but yeah, again, I mean, why? I mean, it's so much simpler to give a basic income first and give people the freedom to do whatever they want
Yeah.
after that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. As I assumed.
That's the answer you expected.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, no, exactly as I assumed. Maybe one of the last questions here, and this is kind of the last question that I asked all of my guests, like the future of whatever topic we're looking at. So if we're looking at, say, the next 10 years as it relates to the universal basic income movement, do you think that we'll see one country fully adopt a universal basic income for all of its citizens, or are we going to see more of these pilot sites kind of proving a lot of the benefits that you've mentioned in the podcast so far? What are your expectations over the next 10 years as it relates to universal basic income?
Well, there are a few countries that are in the race. I think South Korea is very interesting to watch. I mean, one governor who has implemented an experiment is now running for president. If he
Okay.
wins, then it will be implemented because that is in his program, and
Okay.
he's very
Interesting.
popular.
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting country to watch. Um, I think, well, of course, Kenya, because they're gathering so much data now over there. So basic income is really in the minds of the people. If you see the basic income community over there with their t-shirts and their hats, they're just,
Yeah.
advocating for basic income, big style. So that might be a country where the governments may say, okay, this is, we really have to do it because we can no longer prevent it. I don't think Europe will be one of the first continents to implement it. United States is, of course, interesting because there is already a system where people receive unconditional money, at least, well, unconditional in the sense that they have the freedom to decide what to spend it on. So India, well, there are a few states in the north that have politicians that really want to implement a basic income. Sikkim is one of the states, and the surrounding states. So, and if these states do this and they show the results, then that might go fast forward.
Okay.
Yeah, I know it's politics, so we
Yeah.
don't. It's
Yeah.
politics, so difficult to predict what will happen.
It's always one of the hardest questions that I ask, and I think that's why I ask it. So,
Yeah,
but good to
I
hear.
mean, yeah. It took a long time to give women voting rights. It took a long time to get rid of slavery, although it's not completely gone yet. But yes, these things take a long time. But eventually, I mean, it's inevitable. I
Yeah.
think it's inevitable that it
Yeah.
will be implemented somewhere.
Yeah, especially now that we kind of have maybe these two mega trends converging, right? The automation, the impacts of automation, and now COVID, right? The I guess the newfound awareness that I would think would have been found with I mean, the lockdowns and that forced people not able to work. So it kind of created a new understanding that a universal basic income could be a solution to that. I think that's it for the conversation. I want to thank you very much for coming onto the podcast. One of the things that I was curious about, when exactly is this conference that you guys put on? I think it'd be interesting for several of the listeners to join.
It's in August. Let me check the dates so that I don't make a mistake. It's August 18 So Wednesday until Saturday, August 21.
Perfect.
And it's for the first time ever free.
Okay.
So it's open access. Well, you have to register to get access, but organized by Basic Income Network Scotland. It's a record. I think they have more than 200 papers that were submitted.
Okay.
We have a full 4 days of roundtables, presentations, so everyone can register. If you look at the website of Basic Income Earth Network, basicincome.org, then you will find the link to the Basic Income Network Scotland, where you can register for the conference.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll have both the website on the show notes and maybe also a link to the conference itself. Are there any other ways that you want people to follow you or follow the work that your very interesting organization is doing?
Well, I would like to invite people to become a live member of a Basic Income Earth Network. It's a one-time fee, and then you're a lifelong member of a Basic Income Earth Network. Sign up for the newsletter. You don't have to be a member to sign up for the newsletter, but so then you will be updated about almost everything that's happening in the basic income space.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you very much for coming on, Hilde. It's a really interesting conversation, and I'm also really happy that we finally got somebody on to talk about universal basic income, especially as it's becoming one of these more interesting and I'd say even more important themes that COVID has brought about for all of us. So thanks a lot for coming on.
Well, thank you, Mark, for giving it attention.
Absolutely. Thanks. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear and you want to support the podcast and the conversations here, the best way to do this is to go onto Apple Podcasts and leave a review, as it helps the algorithm to reach out to new listeners and brings the show to them. Also, feel free to check out the website, automatedpodcast.org, where you can find the show notes for each episode, written articles on the themes of the podcast, and a library of resources on the topic of emerging tech and automation. Also, if you want to reach out and leave any feedback or you have any questions about the podcast or any of the conversations, there are general contact links such as email, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. for you there on the website. And finally, for those of you that want more than just an audio conversation, the video recordings are now going to be up on YouTube for the newer conversations, so feel free to check out the videos by searching for Automated Podcast on YouTube, where of course you can like and subscribe if you prefer to support the podcast that way.
The Automated Podcast.